The morning in Oak Ridge Estates was quiet enough to hear the distant hum of lawnmowers and the chirping of sparrows that darted from tree to tree along the perfectly manicured lawns. Mark Reynolds liked mornings like this, calm, predictable, and far removed from the chaos that used to define his life as an undercover FBI agent. He leaned against the porch railing of his lakefront home, cradling his favorite mug of coffee, letting the steam drift lazily into the cool air. Everything about Oak Ridge screamed tranquility, until the sharp screech of tires tore through the calm. Mark's eyes narrowed as a black SUV came barreling down the street, stopping with a dramatic skid right in front of his house. The words, "Law Enforcement," were plastered across the sides in bold white lettering that looked like it had been spray-painted by someone who had watched too many police shows. Two men stepped out. Both were tall, wearing tactical vests over black shirts and cargo pants, aviator sunglasses perched on their noses. At first glance, they might have looked intimidating, if you didn't know what to look for. Mark, of course, knew exactly what to look for. The boots were cheap knockoffs. The badges dangling from their belts were the kind you could order online for $9.99, and one of them had his vest straps uneven, like he had never actually worn gear like that before. "Sir," the taller one barked, puffing his chest out in a ridiculous attempt at authority. "Step away from the porch. You're being detained for violating law regulations." Mark blinked, taking a slow, deliberate sip of his coffee. He didn't flinch, didn't even look surprised. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, studying them the way he used to study suspects during deep cover assignments. Every detail screamed amateur hour. "Detained, huh?" Mark said, his voice calm, almost amused. "And what violation am I being detained for?" The man flipped through a clipboard like he was trying to remember his lines. "You've installed unauthorized surveillance equipment on your property. That's a direct violation of Section..." He squinted, fumbling with the paper. "Section 12 of the HOA bylaws." Mark raised an eyebrow. "Section 12, you say?" He had memorized every page of those bylaws the day he moved in. Section 12 was about lawn maintenance. Whoever these clowns were, they hadn't even bothered to do their homework. "That's right," the shorter one chimed in, his voice trembling slightly. "You need to come with us to the HOA office for questioning. Failure to comply will result in additional penalties." Mark took another slow sip, setting the mug gently on the porch railing. His every movement was deliberate, controlled, a stark contrast to their jittery demeanor. "Gentlemen," he said evenly, "before I come with you, I'm going to need to see some credentials. Real credentials, issued by the state or the county. You know, something that actually means you have the authority you're pretending to have." The taller man stiffened, his jaw clenching. "We don't need to show you anything. You're resisting law authority." Mark almost laughed. Instead, he took a step forward, his posture straightening. Years of fieldwork had given him a presence, calm, intimidating, and commanding without raising his voice. He watched as the shorter man instinctively took a small step back. "Resisting law authority," Mark repeated, his tone sharp enough to cut glass. "Do you have any idea what you're doing? You're on private property, dressed like law enforcement, attempting to detain a homeowner without probable cause or warrant." The shorter one swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. We're just following orders. Mrs. Harper, the HOA president, said you'd be a problem." Mark's eyes narrowed slightly. Linda Harper, of course, the self-appointed queen of Oak Ridge Estates, a woman with too much time and too little sense. She'd been complaining for weeks about the new security cameras Mark had installed, muttering about privacy concerns and community aesthetics. Apparently, this was her new tactic. "You're impersonating law enforcement," Mark said quietly, his voice dropping to that low, dangerous register that made grown men sweat. "Do you know what that means?" The taller man tried to hold his ground. "We're not impersonating. We're law enforcement." Mark reached into his jacket, and for a split second, both men froze, their hands twitching toward their belts. But instead of a weapon, Mark pulled out his leather badge holder and flipped it open, revealing the unmistakable gold and blue shield of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Their faces drained of color instantly. "You just attempted to detain a federal agent," Mark said, his words slow and deliberate. "On my own property, without cause. That gentlemen, is a federal offense. The taller man's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. The shorter one looked like he was about to bolt. Mark stepped closer, closing the distance between them. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. His voice carried the weight of authority, honed by years of interrogations and undercover operations. "You have exactly 30 seconds to tell me who sent you and why," he said, his eyes locked on theirs, "before I make one phone call that will have this entire street swarming with agents and squad cars." The shorter man cracked first. It was the HOA president, he stammered, words tumbling out in a rush. "She said you were a problem. That you thought you were above the rules. She told us to scare you, that's all. She said you'd back off if we. Mark's jaw tightened. He'd given Linda Harper every chance to leave him alone. He'd tolerated her passive-aggressive comments at HOA meetings, her snide remarks about his lawn, even her ridiculous fines for unsightly garbage bins. But this, sending two idiots in fake uniforms to intimidate him on his own property. That crossed a line. The taller man tried to speak, but Mark silenced him with a sharp look. "Sit," Mark ordered, pointing to the edge of the porch. They obeyed instantly, like chastened schoolboys, the bravado draining from them completely. Mark pulled his phone from his pocket, his fingers moving with practiced precision as he dialed a number he hadn't used in months but still remembered by heart. When the familiar voice answered on the other end, Mark didn't bother with pleasantries. "This is Reynolds," he said crisply. "Oak Ridge Estates. 2 suspects in custody. Impersonating officers. Send local PD and bureau backup. Now." The men on his porch stared at him, their faces pale, their fake badges suddenly feeling very, very heavy on their chests. Mark didn't look at them again. He simply picked up his coffee, took another calm sip, and waited for the sound of sirens to break the suburban quiet. The wail of approaching sirens broke the silence of Oak Ridge Estates like a sharp blade slicing through fabric. Neighbors peeked out from behind lace curtains and perfectly polished windows, their whispers darting through the pristine cul-de-sac. Word had traveled fast, faster than wildfire. Someone had called in a major incident, and everyone wanted to know what had happened. Mark stayed calm, seated on his porch chair, legs crossed, coffee mug still in hand. Across from him, the 2 fake HOA enforcers sat slumped on the edge of the porch, silent and pale. Their earlier bravado had vanished, leaving nothing but panic and regret written across their faces. "You boys might want to think about what you'll say when the uniforms get here," Mark said evenly, not even looking at them. "Because right now, the only thing saving you from a dozen federal charges is the fact that you're cooperating. Understand?" The taller one nodded quickly, his sunglasses slipping down his nose. The shorter one muttered something inaudible, his hands trembling against his knees. Mark had seen hardened criminals handle pressure better than these 2 wannabes. Moments later, the flashing red and blue lights painted the street in sharp colors. 2 patrol cars pulled up first, tires crunching against the spotless pavement, followed by a black government SUV that Mark knew all too well. The first officer out of the squad car, a young man barely in his 30s, blinked when he saw Mark standing there, calm as ever. "Agent Reynolds," he greeted, already aware of who Mark was. The local PD had been briefed when Mark had bought the property, protocol when a federal agent lived within city limits. "Morning, officer," Mark replied, standing. He gestured casually toward the 2 men on the porch. "Picked these 2 up trying to play cops and robbers on my property. Impersonating officers, attempted unlawful detention, trespassing, harassment, you'll find plenty to charge them with." The officer raised an eyebrow and motioned to his partner, who quickly moved to cuff the imposters. Neither of them resisted. One tried to sputter an excuse, but the sharp click of handcuffs silenced him. By the time the FBI SUV door opened and Special Agent Lisa Navarro stepped out, the neighbors had gathered in clusters, whispering among themselves. Mark ignored them and focused on Navarro, a no-nonsense agent with whom he'd shared more than a few dangerous assignments years ago. "Reynolds," she said with a smirk as she approached. "You know, when you said you were retiring to the suburbs, I didn't think it would take you 6 months to turn it into a crime scene." Mark shrugged, unbothered. Didn't think retirement would come with HOA politics either. Navarro chuckled, her eyes scanning the 2 cuffed men being loaded into the back of a patrol car. "What's the story?" Mark handed her a small envelope, the one he'd picked up from his desk the moment the situation had begun. Inside were stills from his surveillance footage, the two imposters stepping out of the SUV, flashing fake badges, and attempting to coerce him into detention. They were sent by the HOA president, Mark said flatly. Linda Harper. She's been trying to harass me ever since I installed perimeter cameras. Claims they're a violation of community aesthetics. My guess, she figured if she sent a couple of wannabes dressed like law enforcement, I'd back off. Navarro's expression darkened as she flipped through the photos. Impersonating federal officers isn't just a misdemeanor, Reynolds. You know that. This is going to escalate. That's the point, Mark replied, his tone sharp but calm. She wanted to play games. Now she gets to learn what happens when you cross the line. Navarro tilted her head, studying him for a moment. You want us to bring her in? Not yet, Mark said, his voice like steel. I want her to see them arrested first. Let the reality sink in. Then, we'll have a little conversation. As Navarro coordinated with the local officers, Mark leaned against the porch railing, his sharp gaze sweeping the crowd of neighbors still gathered like vultures on the street. He could see Linda Harper herself across the way, standing stiffly on her porch in her signature pastel suit, her lips pressed tightly together. Even from a distance, he could see the way her hand trembled around the coffee cup she clutched. Mark offered her a polite, icy smile. She turned and stormed inside. By noon, the scene had cleared. The imposters were on their way to a federal holding facility, the police cruisers were gone, and the gawking neighbors had retreated to their homes, though Mark knew the gossip would be buzzing through the community text chain for weeks. Navarro stayed behind, leaning against her SUV with her arms crossed. So what's your move? She asked. Mark looked out over his pristine lawn, his jaw set. She thinks she's untouchable. People like her always do. But she just committed a federal crime by orchestrating this stunt. The Bureau will handle the paperwork, but I'll make sure she understands exactly what kind of fire she's been playing with. Navarro smirked. Want backup? Mark shook his head. I've got this. It's personal now. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low over the lake and painted the water gold, Mark prepared for round two. He reviewed the footage again, every angle crystal clear thanks to the cameras Linda had been so desperate to remove. He downloaded everything to an encrypted drive, packaged it neatly, and printed out a concise report. Then, he walked across the street to the Harper residence, the manila envelope tucked under his arm. Linda opened the door before he even knocked, her eyes flashing with forced bravado that didn't quite hide the fear beneath. What do you want, Mr. Reynolds? She snapped. Mark didn't speak at first. He simply handed her the envelope. She hesitated, then opened it, her face draining of color as she flipped through the photos, high-resolution images of her enforcers being cuffed, loaded into cruisers, their fake badges clearly visible. You sent them, Mark said calmly, his voice low and even. You ordered them to impersonate officers and trespass on federal property. That's prison time, Linda. Years, not months. And trust me, the Bureau doesn't take this kind of thing lightly. She started, her voice shaking, but Mark cut her off with a sharp look. I could have you arrested right now, he continued, stepping closer until his presence filled the doorway. But I'm not yet. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to stop harassing me. No more fines. No more fake citations. No more WA nonsense directed my way. You will leave me alone, or the next time I call in a favor, it won't be for two imposters. It'll be for you. Linda's lips trembled. She nodded quickly, her usual arrogance nowhere to be found. Good, Mark said, turning to leave. Enjoy the rest of your evening, Mrs. Harper. By the time he reached his porch again, the tension that had been simmering all day finally began to dissipate. He sat back in his chair, the soft hum of crickets filling the air as the sun sank below the horizon. For the first time since moving to Oak Ridge, Mark allowed himself a genuine smile. The message had been sent, loud and clear. This wasn't a neighborhood where games could be played, not with him. The next WA meeting came and went without so much as a sideways glance in his direction. Linda Harper avoided eye contact entirely, and the entire board seemed suddenly very eager to maintain a cooperative relationship. Mark went back to his quiet mornings and calm evenings, the only difference being the occasional nod of respect from neighbors who now saw him in a different light. And while he knew the suburbs would never be as quiet as he'd once hoped, Mark Reynolds had made one thing abundantly clear. If anyone else tried to bring trouble to his doorstep, they'd better be ready for a fight they couldn't possibly win.